The fluorescent lights on the ceiling of the laundromat buzzed like dying hornets, their sickly yellow glow spilling across the blotched tile floor and casting long, twitching shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. And I felt a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion seep further into me as I dragged the basket of wet clothes toward the only dryer that still worked, the damp denim clinging to my arm through the thin cotton of my t-shirt. The smell of detergent and the faint scorch of burned lint had long since stopped bothering me. After 9 months of working non-stop at Spin Cycle off 17th Road, I had grown numb to everything. My sneakers were split open at the soles, my wrist ached from folding clothes without rest, and the blister on my heel had started bleeding again, soaking through the thin fabric of my sock. But I could not stop, not when Lily's next heart checkup was approaching, and the rent was already 3 days late. Lily was the only reason I was still standing. She was 6 years old, her tiny heart beating with a constant uneven rhythm, as if it might give out at any moment. The doctors said that without surgery this year, the risks would rise sharply, yet my insurance covered only a fraction of the cost, leaving behind figures so staggering they could crush the span of an entire lifetime. I had once dreamed of becoming a nurse, had already completed 2 years of school, but when my mother fell ill, I walked away from it all. Then Lily arrived, and from that moment on, every dream became a luxury I could not afford. This laundromat was never a place meant for easy living. The machines were old, their engines growling like wounded animals. The lights flickered constantly, and the floors were slick with stains no amount of scrubbing could erase. Most customers were poor locals, quiet, irritable, always in a hurry. I opened the doors at 7 in the morning and closed them at 10 every night, day after day, with nothing but a lukewarm jug of coffee and a folding chair with one broken leg to call my office. Each night when I shut down the place, I would linger for a moment, turning off the switches one by one, as if slowing time could help me hold on to something slipping away. But tonight, the air felt different. A strange wind whistled through the crack beneath the door, carrying an unexpected chill for the first days of October, and the ache in my wrist throbbed more sharply. I bent down to pick up a shirt that had fallen from the basket when the little bell above the door rang. It was 10:17. I had already flipped the open sign to dark. No one was supposed to come in at this hour, yet someone did. And from that moment on, everything in my life began to change in ways no one could have foreseen. In the moment when the laundromat door trembled softly behind that unfamiliar man, when the room held nothing but the low growl of the dryer and the tightening rhythm of a night that seemed quiet yet brimmed with omens, I suddenly realized that every story, much like the uneven steps he took, carries its own mystery that only reveals its truth when we follow it all the way into the darkness. And if you are listening to this journey and feel even the faintest stir of emotion, please subscribe to our channel, tap like, and share so that more people can step into this world filled with unexpected turns. Tell me where you are listening from. Leave a comment below, just a single line, so I may know which neighborhoods, which cities, which hearts across this wide world this small journey of mine has managed to reach. The man stood there at the threshold, his shoulders slightly hunched as if he were trying to hide some private ache, his shadow stretching long beneath the dim light and laying a heavy dark smear across the floor, his black coat falling to his knees and soaked with night mist, its hem stained with dirt, his thick hair wet and tangled, obscuring part of a lean, hardened face, though I could still see the small cut on his left cheek where the blood had only just dried, and in that first instant instinct told me to be cautious. Yet something about him made it impossible for me to turn away, not fear, but a strange sense that this man had weathered something terrible, and that the only thing keeping him upright was sheer will. I removed my glasses, wiped them with the edge of my shirt, trying to appear calm. "I'm sorry, the shop is closed," I said, my voice not entirely steady. He did not answer right away. His eyes swept the room quickly, then returned to mine with a gaze that held no threat but carried a cold sharpness, as if he were evaluating me, weighing something I could not name. "I just need to use the dryer for a few minutes," he said, his voice hoarse, low, clipped, with an accent that was not local northern, more urban, and threaded with something wounded. I meant to refuse, but his eyes drifted to the wrinkled shirt still in my hand, resting there for a heartbeat before softening, not quite apologetic, not quite grateful, just a quiet acknowledgement. He lifted the gray canvas bag in his hand as if to prove his purpose, and I gave a small nod, pointing toward the row of dryers in the back. "The last one on the right. The others are broken or running." He walked in with a slight limp, and as he passed me the faint scent of sweat, metal and dust rose like a warning, and I saw clearly that his left hand was wrapped in a strip of black fabric already darkened with dried blood, not a deadly wound, but far from minor. He did not ask for help, did not complain, only opened the bag and placed several pieces of clothing inside the machine, each movement slow and careful, as if his body were fighting against itself. I stood at the counter, eyes fixed on the tiny security camera screen mounted on the wall, still displaying the view of the entrance outside empty. Yet I felt the unsettling sensation that someone was watching, or perhaps I was simply exhausted enough to imagine things. He sat on the bench beside the dryer, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his breath heavy but steady, as though he were forcing himself to remain in control. I quietly poured a cup of water from the plastic jug behind the counter and set it beside him, and he looked up, slightly surprised, offering nothing but a brief nod. I took the seat across from him, keeping a safe distance, my hands curled around my cup of cold coffee. The laundromat sank into silence, broken only by the whir of the dryer and the tick of the wall clock. I did not know who this man was, or why he had come here at this hour with a wounded hand and eyes that looked as if they had just climbed out of hell. But I knew one thing: tonight would not resemble any night before it, and something lurking just behind the false calm of this small room was waiting to break open everything. The dryer kept spinning in steady, uneven circles, rattling with a hollow clatter as if it, too, were struggling to survive each rotation, and I remained there facing the stranger, while the weak bulb overhead carved his features into sharp, stone-like angles, the small cut on his left cheek beginning to harden, a bruised dark trace at the edge of his lip, leaving me unsure whether it came from a blade or from a simple collision. Yet what held my attention more than the wound was the gray canvas bag beside his feet, the same one he had pulled his clothes from earlier, left slightly open, so that when he shifted his body a metallic glint flashed from within and froze me for several seconds. For I didn't need to be close to know what it was. A compact black semi-automatic pistol. Not a toy, not a replica, but the real thing. And beside it something that looked like a leather wallet, though not the ordinary kind, with a small metal badge tucked into its corner. The lettering too far for me to make out, leaving my mind suddenly blank. My entire body pulled into a sharp, instinctive alertness, while my heart pounded so loudly it felt almost audible. And a part of me wanted to rise, bolt out of the laundromat, call the police, call anyone. But the other part, deeper, steadier, kept me seated, because he had not hidden the weapon, had not closed the bag, as though it didn't matter that I saw it, or as though he somehow knew I wouldn't react. And for the first time I truly looked at him, not at the wound or the tired eyes, but at the way he sat, the posture, the stillness, the way his bandaged left hand rested close to the bag, not overtly defensive yet positioned to react in an instant, not the posture of some reckless criminal but of someone trained, highly trained, and strangely I did not feel fear, only a brief shiver that vanished just as quickly because there was nothing threatening in him, nothing aggressive, only a quiet sorrow in the way he held himself, like a man carrying a burden the world had no means of lifting. And I rose, walked back to the counter, willing my hands not to tremble as I pulled tissues and a few adhesive bandages from the small drawer, returning to hand them to him with a simple, "Your hand is bleeding. Use these for now." And he looked up at me, our eyes meeting directly for the first time, his gray gaze cold but not empty, something shifting there like a thick sheet of ice cracking under the warmth of something gentler, more human. And he murmured a low, almost hoarse thank you, taking the tissues but not using them immediately, only holding them in his hand, while I, for reasons I could not explain, heard myself say, "My name is Maya," as if offering my name might soften the tension in the air, and he looked at me without a smile but with a small nod. Ethan. One word, then silence again. I did not ask anything more, not about the gun, not about the injury, not about why he appeared here at this hour, because I was not sure I wanted to know. But what I did know was that tonight destiny had allowed a stranger named Ethan to step into my life carrying something that would alter everything. And when the dryer chimed with a dry metallic ding, announcing the end of its cycle, Ethan did not move, and neither did I. And in the silence, something fragile and uncertain began to germinate, like beads of condensation gathering on the shop's glass door, while outside the night crouched low, holding its breath over something neither of us could yet name. The wind chime above the door rang again, sharp and sudden, jolting me, and Ethan rose instantly, the motion so fast I barely registered the way he grabbed his bag and retreated toward the row of washers along the left wall, and by reflex I glanced toward the entrance just as two men stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in dark, long coats with low-brimmed caps hiding most of their faces, neither carrying laundry, neither scanning for open machines, because they had not come here to wash clothes. One approached the counter while the other stayed behind, his eyes sweeping the room as if checking each hidden corner, and a cold bead of sweat traced its way down my spine. Ethan had vanished from sight, surely tucked behind the large industrial washers, and I refused to glance his way even as my heartbeat hammered against my ribs. "Is the place still open?" the man in front asked, his voice low and gritty with a forced hint of grogginess, and I forced a strained smile, trying to keep my voice level. "No, I'm about to close. The last dryer cycle just finished. Is something wrong?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze flicked toward the row of machines behind me where Ethan had been standing, then back to my face. "Did you see a stranger come in tonight? Could be injured, carrying a gray bag?" I swallowed hard. My fingers locked around the cold coffee cup until my knuckles blanched. "Just a few regulars. A little girl came in to dry a blanket around 7. Then an older lady washed a small rug. No one like what you're describing." The man behind him took a step forward, suspicion tightening his eyes. "You sure?" "Sure," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "I work here every night. No one injured. And if someone really were hurt, I would have called the police already." They stared at me for several seconds, their eyes scraping over each word for cracks, and I didn't know what I was doing anymore. I wasn't used to lying. I was just a single mother working in a laundromat, someone who had nothing to do with guns or men carrying blood in their bags. But in that moment I knew only one thing. If I admitted that a man like that was hiding behind the washers, I would be handing him over to people with no good intentions. And somehow I believed Ethan was not the one to fear. A taut silence stretched between us before the man in front gave a slight nod, as if deciding to believe me. "If you see anyone like that, call this number." He placed a worn business card on the counter. No name, just a string of digits, and I did not reach for it. They left without looking back, the door chime ringing again, this time sounding like a retreating warning. I waited a few seconds before hurrying to the back row of machines where Ethan was pressed into the narrow space between two huge washers, his gaze still fixed on the door, and only when I motioned to him did he slowly ease out. "Who were they?" I asked, though a part of me already knew. He didn't answer right away, his eyes guarded yet carrying a flicker of something that felt like gratitude. "Not friends," he said quietly, his voice rough. "And not the police." I nodded. Nothing more needed to be said. The business card still lay on the counter, a reminder that those men would return, and next time might not come only for questions. I picked it up, glanced at the number, then dropped it into the trash beneath the counter. Ethan remained still, his entire body drawn tight around something I could not see. I didn't know why I had lied for a stranger, why I had shielded him from two men who clearly meant trouble, but when I looked into those cold gray eyes, I understood with certainty that from this moment on I had stepped into a story with no way back, and deep inside I felt fear yet stranger still. The fear did not outweigh the curiosity. The laundromat fell silent again after the two men left, but the air no longer felt the same. It thickened, as though even the dust hanging in the weak light carried some invisible threat, and Ethan stepped out from his hiding place, moving slowly, methodically checking every direction while I stood behind the counter, with my hand still braced against its surface, as if it were the only thing keeping my breath steady, and I looked at him openly this time. "I just risked my job and possibly my life to hide you," I said, my voice low but steady. "I think I deserve to know who you are and what's going on." Ethan watched me for a moment, his face not revealing much, but his shoulders lowered slightly, as if he had just surrendered an inner battle, and he approached the counter, set the canvas bag between us, and slowly unzipped it. He placed the gun to the side, then pulled out a small rectangular object, worn and frayed at the edges, flipping it open toward me so that the badge glimmered faintly under the light. A silver 5-pointed star encircled by letters that took me a few seconds to register. The Federal Bureau of Investigation. Ethan Callahan, federal agent. A cold shiver ran down my spine. "I used to be one of them," he said, his voice even and low. 13 years on the job, mostly working internal corruption and money laundering cases. 3 months ago, my team and I uncovered a major network involving high-ranking officials not just taking bribes, but covering for organized crime, destroying evidence, staging murders to look like accidents. He paused, choosing his words carefully, not to dramatize but to spare the listener. "I thought I could trust my superiors. I was wrong." His eyes dropped to the counter. "We were set up. One member of my team was killed. Another disappeared. And me. They framed me. They broadcast that I stole classified files, threatened national security. Now there's a federal warrant out for me. I'm being hunted not only by criminals but by powerful people who were once my colleagues. I stayed quiet, feeling the floor tilt beneath my feet. Why come to my laundromat? I asked, not accusing. Just a woman trying to understand why her life had been pulled into something far larger than anything she had ever known. Ethan replied, I had no choice. I needed a place to rest for a few hours, dry my clothes, clean the blood. This place is far from the center, with no police-connected cameras. I mapped out locations like this before I started running. Do you have proof of what you're saying? I asked, my heart pounding even though my voice remained steady. Yes, he answered, meeting my eyes again. But not with me. I hid the data on an encrypted drive in a safe place. I'll retrieve it only when I'm sure I'm not being followed. If they get to me first, everything disappears with me. I nodded faintly, my mind spinning with too much information, as Ethan tucked the badge, the gun, and the worn wallet back into the bag with the practiced precision of someone who had done this 100 times. I don't want you and your daughter dragged into this, Maya, he said quietly, his gaze solemn. I just need a few hours. Then I'll go. But what he didn't know was that I had heard promises like, just a moment, I'll be gone soon from another man once, and I paid for it with my youth. Yet this time, I did not feel I was repeating an old mistake. I saw only one thing in the man standing before me. The truth, and truth, I realized, can be far more terrifying than any lie. Outside, the night had begun to gather mist, thin patches of gray clinging to the shop's front glass and blurring the faint glow of the street lamp. And as I wiped the last stains near the washer, that prickling sensation of being watched slid down my spine like a cold wire. It wasn't the sharp terror of danger, but the instinctive awareness of a mother who had spent years wary of anything that might threaten her little girl. I turned toward the window, squinting through the fogged-over pane, and in a flicker of a moment I saw a figure standing across the street, not smoking, not looking at a phone, just standing still with his hands buried in his coat pockets, his head slightly bowed as if waiting for something or someone. I jerked back, bumping into the service counter. Ethan, who had been checking his bag with one hand while pressing a cloth to the wound at his wrist with the other, looked up immediately. I didn't need to speak. One glance was enough. He drew the gun without hesitation and pulled me swiftly toward the storage room at the back, where a narrow door opened into the alley, pressing his back to the wall, breathing steady but keeping his eyes fixed on the front entrance. My heart hammered so loudly it drowned out the faint hum of the machines, cold sweat sliding down the back of my neck, and Ethan whispered in a firm, commanding tone, Maya, listen to me. You need to leave now. Do not go home. Do not go to Lily, not yet. They may have tracked me here. Or worse, they may think you're involved. They will not ignore a woman who hid me. I shook my head, the words spilling out with instinctive desperation. I can't leave my daughter. I can't just disappear. Ethan placed a hand on my shoulder, steady, restrained, but firm enough to anchor me, his eyes locking on mine with slow, deliberate clarity, as if carving each word into my mind. I will not let them hurt you or your daughter. But if you stay, you make yourself a target. I can deal with them, but not while worrying about your safety. Go. Take Lily. I have a safe place, a small cabin about 3 hours from here. I'll give you the address. I stared at him, searching for even a flicker of uncertainty, but all I found was the hard, lucid resolve of someone who had lived too long at the edge of life and death to ever confuse the moment to hold on with the moment to run. I accepted that not with words, but with action. I nodded, returned to the counter, grabbed my keys, and shut off every switch. Ethan handed me a small scrap of paper with the cabin's address and a string of lock codes written in cramped handwriting, and I tucked it into my wallet with a few coins and my car keys. As I moved toward the back door, he called after me. Maya, if anything feels wrong, anything at all, pull into the nearest gas station and call the number on the back of the paper. It's a safe line. Do not call the police. Do not call anyone else. I looked back at him once more. Without speaking, there was nothing left to say. Then I stepped into the rear alley, letting the darkness fold around me, each step carrying me into a future I could not see. The night wind cut across the narrow walkway, sharp and cold, and for the first time in years my fear was not of poverty or illness, but of something larger, realer, and rapidly closing in. I drove through the night with both hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. The highway leading back toward the motel where Lily and I lived nearly empty, yet each passing street lamp streaked across the windshield like a watching eye. turning every glance at the rearview mirror into a cold shiver. Ethan had given me the address of the cabin, but not when he would meet us there. The only thing I knew was that I had to get Lily away before anyone else came looking. But in my mind, a larger question looped endlessly like a broken record. What am I doing? I was taking my daughter and fleeing with a man I had known for less than a single night. A man hunted by criminals and the government alike. I was betraying common sense, betraying the thin thread of stability we had left. By the time I reached the motel, the clock was nearing 2 a.m. I slipped the door open as quietly as possible. The small room at the end of the second-floor hallway held only 2 narrow beds, a folding table, and an old mini-fridge that groaned through the night. Lily was fast asleep, curled like a small kitten in the thin blankets, her chest rising and falling with that fragile rhythm so familiar to children born with heart defects. I sat on the edge of the bed and brushed her hair back, tears spilling before I realized they were there. I could not drag her into this. I could not let a reckless decision destroy the only hope I still held for her. But I also could not leave her here, knowing someone might be watching me, someone who would not hesitate to hurt a child if they believed she was a weakness. I paced the tiny room like a caged animal. Almost 3 a.m, I opened my phone and looked again at the address Ethan had written on that small scrap of paper, my fingers trembling as I typed it into the map application. The location showed a cabin near the edge of a national forest, far from any main road, a place so remote it barely registered except on satellite view. I closed the phone, walked back to Lily, and gently woke her. "Mom, it's not even morning," she murmured, her voice soft and watery with sleep. "I know," I whispered, "but you and I need to go somewhere for a while, all right? Somewhere quiet, where no one will bother us." As I spoke, I packed a few sets of clothes, her medication, her medical records, and the small amount of cash I kept hidden at the bottom of the drawer. Lily rubbed her eyes, leaned against my shoulder, and said nothing. She was used to moving between temporary places. She had never had a real home. Before dawn, I had loaded everything into the car, wrapped Lily in a thick blanket, and carried her out to the passenger seat. The engine started, its familiar rumble suddenly making my heart pound. I looked back at the motel one last time, the place I had hoped would be a long enough stop for her to recover. Then I turned the car toward the northern highway and followed the directions on the map. Mile after mile unfurled beneath the dull yellow lights, and I felt something growing inside my chest, not fear alone, but a strange acceptance. I did not know whether I was doing the right thing or whether Ethan was truly someone I could trust, but I knew I had no way back. And somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that something was waiting for me ahead, not just an old cabin or a wounded man, but the truth itself, and perhaps the beginning of something new. The road leading to the cabin was narrow and uneven, bordered on both sides by dense pine woods where the early morning light filtered only faintly through the towering branches, casting dull streaks across the dirt path. And when the map told me to turn left at a small wooden marker almost worn invisible by time, I followed a few more minutes of tight winding curves, until the slanted wooden roof emerged through a thin veil of mist. The cabin was small, built from old rough timber with a tiny front porch and a crooked hanging swing, and Ethan had arrived before us, his car parked beside an old maple tree with dried mud still clinging to one side. As I stopped the car, he stepped out of the cabin wearing the same black coat, his left arm still wrapped in a makeshift bandage, and he opened the door for me, then bent down with a faint smile toward Lily, who sat in the back seat looking drowsy and disoriented. "Hey there, kiddo," he said, his voice gentler than I had ever heard it, and Lily stared at him with widening eyes before whispering to me, just quiet enough that he could not hear, "Mom, is he a superhero?" I smiled without answering, brushing a hand over her hair. Inside, the cabin was cleaner than I expected, minimalist and a little cold, but warmed by the small fireplace in the center where flames crackled softly, and Ethan had already made a pot of ginger tea, placing it on the wooden table beside a plate of dry biscuits. He invited us to sit, then removed the bandage on his hand. The wound had swollen, ringed with red, the edges crusted with dried blood. I stood to retrieve the bandages and antiseptic from the small medical kit I always carried for Lily, then sat beside him. "Let me help," I said, and though he hesitated for a heartbeat, he offered his hand. I cleaned the wound gently, feeling the tension in the muscles beneath his sun-browned skin. Despite the pain, he didn't flinch, only watched me intently as I wrapped a fresh bandage around his wrist, with motions that came back to me from my unfinished nursing days. Lily sat across the table with her chin propped on her hands, staring without blinking. "Did you fight bad guys?" she asked. Ethan gave a soft smile, neither nodding nor shaking his head. "Only when I really have to. Mommy says fighting is bad," Lily answered with the sternness of a tiny schoolteacher. And Ethan laughed, truly laughed, and it was the first time I had seen him look anything close to lighthearted. "Your mom is right," he said. Lily studied him for a moment, then reached out and touched the white bandage. "Does it hurt?" Ethan shook his head. "Not as much as a cat scratch." The answer made Lily giggle, her bright laughter slicing through the thin tension that had weighed down the room since we arrived, and she dragged her chair closer, offering him a biscuit as if awarding him a medal. Watching them, something tightened and softened in my chest all at once. Ethan was not the kind of man who invited closeness, yet Lily had done what I had failed to do for so many years. She made a man who looked as though he had lost all hope smile with something genuine. The morning light slowly strengthened outside, a pale gold beam slanting through the window and tinting the cabin in a warm, gentle glow, and in that fragile moment I felt something that resembled a home, not because of the wood or the fire or the tea, but because in this room, with a wounded man being bandaged and a little girl chattering about superhero cats, I found a piece of peace I had never known, but I also knew it would not last. Peace never arrives without a price. By late afternoon, the gentle light of the fading day spilled across the cabin's wooden floor in long golden bands, casting a strangely peaceful glow, and Lily had fallen asleep on the small sofa near the fireplace, a comic book tucked against her chest, crumbs still clinging to her tiny fingers. I draped a blanket over her and returned to the table where Ethan sat quietly, staring out the window, his silence stretching on ever since we finished the simple lunch the three of us had cooked together, and no one had spoken of running or chasing, of guns or blood, or the men who had stalked the laundromat. Everything inside the cabin felt suspended in a fragile hush of questions and waiting. I sat across from him, both hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, and finally spoke, my voice cautious. "You don't seem anything like what I imagined someone on the run would be." "Not at all." Ethan tilted his head slightly, those deep gray eyes settling on me, and after a moment he lowered his voice, speaking slowly, each word deliberate, as if brushing against an old wound that had never healed. 4 years ago, I had a niece named Emily. She meant everything to me. Her parents died in an accident, and I was the only one left to care for her. Emily was bright and lively and always smiling, but she had a small heart defect and needed regular checkups. He paused, drawing a deep breath, as though even the air had thickened around the memory. That year, I was investigating a money laundering ring tied to several state officials. One of the main suspects had connections to the regional health director. When I started getting too close, one of the consequences was that Emily's medical appointments were suddenly rescheduled, her prescriptions delayed. By the time I realized something was wrong, it was already too late. She went into acute heart failure in the middle of the night. I called for an ambulance, but it arrived more than 30 minutes late because my address had been changed in the dispatch system. He let out a dry, hollow laugh, the kind without a trace of humor. Everyone said it was a technical error, but I knew it was a warning. I said nothing, feeling the cold creep into my bones even though the fire still crackled steadily. I looked at him and saw not just the stare of a betrayed agent, but of a man who had lost the most precious thing in his life and had never forgiven himself. After Emily's funeral, I took a leave of absence and started investigating everything from scratch. I didn't trust anyone anymore. I gathered evidence, encrypted the files, reached out to independent journalists, and then it happened. They found out. They came to my house, tore everything apart, turned me into a target. The arrest warrant went out 2 days after I sent the first packet to a freelance reporter in Chicago. Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes fixed on the wooden wall where the last light of the day was fading. I lost everything. My colleagues, my name, my family. I have nothing left except the truth. And now I'm just trying to protect it however I can, not for me anymore, but for people like Emily, like Lily. I pressed a hand over my mouth, trying to keep a sob from breaking loose. Something inside me cracked, not from fear but from a quiet sorrow, as if I were seeing a reflection of my own losses in his. It had been a long time since I let my heart open to another person, not because they needed me to trust them, but because I wanted to. And Ethan, with all the wounds still bleeding inside him, was no longer the stranger who stepped into the laundromat at midnight. He was a human being, a good man lost in a world that no longer had room for a conscience. 3 days after we arrived at the cabin, Ethan woke earlier than usual, and I found him sitting at the wooden table, the faint glow of the oil lamp casting worry-lined shadows across his face, while his fingers tapped steadily over the keyboard of an old laptop connected to a small black hard drive. It was the first time I had seen him open that device since the night we met. The screen scrolled through lines of code, documents, and images I could not fully grasp, but I knew they held everything he had risked his life to protect. Ethan remained silent all morning, speaking only when Lily woke and called him over to help make her milk, then returning to the table with complete focus, sometimes pausing for long minutes over a block of text, sometimes typing as though racing against time. I didn't ask anything. I simply brewed coffee, set it by his computer, and took Lily outside so she wouldn't disturb him. Near noon, Ethan finally lifted his head, his eyes red from lack of sleep, his voice raw. "I found it." I stared at him, not yet understanding, until he turned the laptop toward me and pointed at a photograph on the screen. A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, a perfectly pressed suit, and the cold, practiced gaze of someone accustomed to handshakes made in the shadows. John Ryland, Ethan's former direct superior, once the head of internal investigations, once decorated for exposing a major corruption scandal 5 years earlier, the man Ethan had trusted completely. He was the one who stole Ethan's internal report before everything fell apart. He was the one who coordinated the task force hunting Ethan after every piece of evidence had been falsified. Ethan had gathered encrypted emails, recordings of internal meetings, even a video of Ryland receiving cash from a representative of the very laundering network they were investigating. When I asked what he planned to do with the evidence, he replied simply, "Send it to the press." Not to a major outlet those had been compromised or too afraid to touch the story without ironclad proof, but to an independent investigative newspaper known for publishing leaked documents from a major litigious pharmaceutical case. Before sending anything, Ethan encrypted the files again, split them into segments, routed them through multiple servers, and used an anonymous account, ending his message with one single line: "If anything happens to me, this is what they do not want you to know." When he pressed send, I saw his hand tremble not from fear, but from the knowledge that once the data left his possession, nothing could ever go back to the way it was. He wasn't just exposing the truth, he was turning himself into a target larger than ever. When I asked if he regretted it, he looked at me for a long moment and answered softly, "I couldn't save Emily because I believed in the system. This time I can't stay silent." That night Ethan sat alone on the front porch, a half-burned cigarette smoldering between his fingers, its ember flickering in the dark. I watched him through the cabin window, my heart sinking beneath a mixture of fear and admiration. I knew he wasn't perfect, not a flawless savior, but he had chosen to do the right thing even when it meant facing the greatest danger. And I also knew that from the moment he pressed that button, the storm had begun to gather, and it would soon find its way to where we were. Yet strangely, I no longer wanted to run. The instinct to flee for survival had faded. What remained was the desire to stay, to face what was coming, and to stand beside the man carrying a piece of truth the world had worked so hard to bury. Night fell faster than usual, gray clouds gathering like a warning that something heavy was closing in. And while Ethan sat silently at the table checking the encrypted transmission routes, I tried to soothe Lily to sleep on the chair near the fireplace. The cabin, already quiet, felt even more suffocating as a rising unease crept through me bit by bit, and whether it was the flicker of the flame or the odd rustle of leaves outside, my heart began beating faster, as if my body sensed something long before my mind did. I rose slowly and lifted the curtain just enough to look through and froze. Something was moving behind the trees, no clear shape, but far too large to be any forest animal. Another movement to the left, unmistakably a human silhouette. I spun back toward Ethan, and he saw the panic in my eyes. He asked nothing, only shot to his feet fast enough to topple his chair, stepped beside me for a brief glance through the narrow opening, and within a heartbeat he had drawn the black Glock from his coat, silent and precise as he was himself. Without a word, he signaled for me to turn off all the lights, then moved toward Lily with swift, soundless steps, and I pulled the blanket over her before carrying her into the back room. She had barely begun to stir awake when Ethan entered and handed me a small backpack containing some dry food, medicine, 2 flashlights, and a map of the surrounding forest. "Take the back door," he whispered. "Follow the western trail. If I don't come back within 15 minutes, keep going. And whatever happens, don't look back." I grabbed his hand, fear rising to my throat like something alive, and he squeezed gently one final reassurance before pushing me toward the rear exit. I carried Lily into the darkness, my footsteps heavy as stone. The moment we reached the tree line, gunshots cracked through the air, violent and deafening, ripping the stillness apart. I dropped to the ground with Lily in my arms, her cry muffled by my hand as I whispered, trembling, "Stay quiet. You have to stay quiet." I couldn't go back, but each shot carved into my chest like a blade. That was Ethan alone, facing men he knew were not here to arrest him but to erase him. A sharp cry followed, unmistakably the sound of someone wounded. I bit down hard and rose, weaving through the trees back toward the cabin. In the thin beam of the lone working flashlight, I found Ethan collapsed by the back door, his hand pressed against a dark, spreading patch over his abdomen, and a stranger lay lifeless nearby with his gun flung aside. Ethan opened his eyes when he heard me, breath ragged. I knelt beside him, lifting his shirt to find a deep wound spilling warm blood, and without thinking I pulled bandages from the backpack and pressed down hard. His hand closed weakly over mine. "Go? Maya, don't stay." I shook my head, tears burning but refusing to fall. "I'm not leaving you." He tried to sit up, only to collapse again. Footsteps pounded toward the cabin. There was no time. I braced myself, slid my arms beneath his shoulders, and dragged him inch by inch out of the cabin. By some luck, the back door opened onto a downward slope hidden from view, and I pulled him down into a thick cluster of trees. As I dragged him through the brush, I whispered, desperate, "You are not dying. Not now. Not after everything." Heavy footsteps stormed into the cabin. I held Ethan close, his blood soaking through my shirt, hot against my skin like a warning, and Lily was somewhere on the western trail, unaware of what was happening. I waited until the noise inside the cabin subsided, then moved as quietly as possible toward the path where I had sent her. I found her curled beside a large rock, her eyes wet but clutching her old stuffed bear, and when she saw us she ran forward, her small voice breaking. "Mom, is he going to be okay?" I didn't answer. I only pulled her into my arms, then lifted Ethan again, guiding us all deeper into the forest, the only place left that might keep us alive. That night, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. My life would never return to what it had been, and sometimes love is born not from sweetness, but from the very edge between life and death. We moved through the forest all night, never daring to stop for long, resting only in brief moments so I could rebandage Ethan's wound and let Lily drift into short, exhausted sleep. But by the time dawn filtered through the needles of the trees, and my legs felt hollow, and my hands were stained with blood and mud, Ethan no longer stirred. He lay motionless on the jacket I had placed beneath him, his breath so faint I could not tell whether I truly heard it or was only wishing for it, and when I shook him and called his name again and again, there was only a terrible silence in return. Lily gripped my hand tightly, her face pale, not crying, only waiting for an answer I could not give. I could not believe Ethan was gone. I could not leave him, yet I knew I could not carry him farther, not when Lily was coughing from the cold, not when I had no idea how far we were from the nearest sign of civilization. I used my knife to cut branches of pine and cover him, leaving my old watch beside him as a marker, then lifted Lily onto my back and kept walking. At last, when the sun climbed higher, I found a narrow dirt road and then an abandoned gas station. The young attendant did not ask many questions when I arrived with a child in a blood-soaked shirt. I borrowed the phone and did not call the police. Instead, I dialed the number Ethan had written on the scrap of paper. A woman answered, asked nothing about who I was, only told me to leave the station within 15 minutes. 2 hours later, an older man arrived in a silver pickup truck, took Lily and me without a word, and drove us to a small roadside motel near the state border. I did not know who he was, only that when I turned on the television that night, the late evening news showed Ethan's photograph. They called him a fugitive former federal agent, said his burned body had been found near a cabin deep in the woods not far from the border, said police discovered weapons and classified files beside the corpse, claimed there were signs he had taken his own life after a shootout. I sat frozen, holding Lily asleep in my arms, my heart squeezed as if by an unseen hand. I wanted to scream that it was all wrong, that he had been hunted, forced to fight, that he had saved us, but I knew that if I spoke, everything Ethan sacrificed would be wiped away. I thought of his eyes as I dragged him through the forest, of his lips whispering something faint, words I couldn't quite hear. I couldn't cry, not now. I had to live, for Lily, and for him. I turned off the television and held my daughter closer, listening to her heartbeat like a reminder that life still remained, that even if the world believed he was dead, he still lived in me. Ethan had chosen silence, and I would honor it. But deep inside, I swore this was not the end, and someday, the truth would come to light in the very way he gave everything to protect. I returned to the city after nearly 3 weeks on the run, bringing Lily with me and carrying a hollow ache I had no name for. No one came looking for me, no police, no investigators, no questions about the laundromat that had once been watched. And no one spoke Ethan Callahan's name anymore as the headlines shifted to a new scandal, the public drifting past it like a passing breeze until everything sank into silence. I asked for my old job back at Spin Cycle on 17th Road, and the owner didn't question much. He only glanced at the fresh scar on my wrist before nodding his approval. Everything appeared the same as before, but I was no longer the woman I had been months earlier. I was no longer afraid of the dark, yet I feared quiet that lasted too long, and though I didn't cry during my shifts anymore, I felt a soft, constant sadness settling like dust over my fingers each time I folded clothes. Lily grew quieter as well. She seldom asked about Ethan, yet each night before bed she placed her stuffed bear beside her, as if waiting for someone to come claim it. I took her back to school, returned to the cycle of doctor appointments, prescriptions, and medical notes. Some nights I dreamed of Ethan not in moments of blood or danger, but of him smiling by the dining table with the firelight flickering in his eyes, and I woke with my heart pounding so hard it sounded like someone knocking at the door, though no one was ever there, until one Tuesday morning. I was standing behind the counter holding the electricity bill when my phone buzzed lightly in my pocket. A text from an unsaved number. A simple string of words appeared. "Don't trust anyone. I'm safe. We'll see you." I froze. No name, no signature, nothing to identify the sender. But I knew. That feeling could never be mistaken. I read the message again and again as if each word held an entire soul. My hands trembled, my heart pounding like a drum. I ran into the break room, shut the door, leaned against the wall, and pressed the phone to my chest as if clutching a heartbeat returned from a long winter sleep. Ethan was alive. He had staged his own death, slipped through the net closing around him, and somehow still watched over us, remembering me, remembering Lily. I didn't know how he could have survived a wound so deep, or how he vanished from the eyes of the entire government, but I knew Ethan never lied unless he had no choice, and if he said he would see me again, then he would. I didn't reply. I didn't dare. My phone might be monitored. Perhaps he only needed to know I was still safe. But it was enough. That single line. Enough to bring me back to life. The pain inside me remained, but now something else stirred hope. Not the gray memory of what once was, but a waiting that finally had shape. I put my phone in the drawer, washed my face, and returned to the counter as though nothing had happened. But inside me, something had changed forever. I knew I was no longer alone, and however long it took before I saw him again, I would be ready. Because once more, just when I began to believe he no longer existed, Ethan stepped out of the darkness. A week after that message, I still couldn't sleep through an entire night. The smallest sounds made me flinch. Every unfamiliar customer who stepped into the laundromat made me wary, and each car that paused outside sent my heart jolting as I wondered what might happen next. But on a drizzly Friday afternoon when cold wind swept down 17th Road, I saw a man standing at the far end of the parking lot, his hood pulled low, his hands tucked into the pockets of a dark brown coat, and at first I thought I was imagining things, but when he walked in and moved quietly along the row of washers, like any ordinary customer, I recognized the way he carried himself, the breadth of his shoulders, and the flicker in his eyes even in that brief glance. "Ethan." I dropped the stack of folded clothes in my hands, said nothing, simply stared at him as if afraid he would vanish if I dared blink. He made a small gesture and then walked into the restroom at the end of the hall. A few minutes later, I followed, pretending to check the detergent supply, and when I opened the door, he was there, thinner, paler, but alive. He pulled me inside, closed the door, and for a moment I didn't know whether to cry or throw my arms around him, but he pressed a finger to his lips, urging silence, then whispered softly that he didn't have much time. I nodded, barely catching my breath as I spoke his name just to be sure this was real. He told me that after withdrawing from the cabin, he had been helped by one former colleague, the only person left he could trust. He told me that shortly after I left, his former colleague tracking the signal from the watch I had left behind found him barely alive. It was this colleague who returned to the cabin, dragged the hitman's body inside, and set the fire to stage the scene, buying Ethan time to vanish. Later, they hacked into the coroner's database to swap the dental records, ensuring the burned remains were identified as Ethan Callahan, while he vanished into the shadows to heal and track them down, and during that time he kept tracking the men who had betrayed him and the country. Ryland had been forced into quiet retirement, not because of the files Ethan sent, but because independent journalists, receiving copies of the data Ethan had scattered across numerous channels, launched a wave of reports that the government could no longer bury. Some men were exposed, some vanished, and others still clung to power with money and threats. But the terrifying part, Ethan said, was that there was another group never once appearing in any official file standing above everything. They were the reason he was still being watched, even though the world believed he was dead. He took a small device from his coat pocket, little more than a thin black piece of plastic without buttons, and placed it in my hand. If you see anyone following you, anyone trying to get to you or to Lily, press and hold it for seconds. I will know. I looked at him, my eyes full of questions I couldn't even begin to voice 3. And Ethan lowered his head slightly, his fingers brushing the old scar he once helped bandage, whispering that he couldn't stay, not yet, but he promised he was close, watching over us, and when everything truly ended, he would come back, not as a ghost or a fugitive hiding in the shadows, but as himself. I didn't ask when. I didn't ask what truly ended meant. I simply looked at him, nodded, and knew I had to trust him once more. Ethan opened the door and slipped out as if he had never been there. I stood in the small room for several long minutes, my heart pounding as though it had been brought back to life again. He was alive. He was fighting. And this time, I would not just wait. I would be ready, because I knew the battle was far from over, but this love, even in silence, burned on like a flame that could not be extinguished. 3 weeks after that brief encounter, I received an unmarked parcel at the laundromat. Inside was a small box wrapped in black fabric, with no note, no signature, only a simple silver ring resting quietly within. Its muted gleam striking my eyes like a silent question echoing straight into my heart. I didn't know whether Ethan had left the city or was still hiding somewhere nearby. But every night when I came home and saw Lily sleeping peacefully, I wondered if he stood somewhere in the shadows watching us, making sure we were safe without ever stepping forward. Then one late evening, just after I locked the shop, he appeared from beneath the trees across the street. No rush, no words. We looked at each other like two people who had grown accustomed to speaking through silence, and walked side by side without needing to say a thing. Ethan led me to a small park where we once took Lily the previous Christmas, when snow drifted lightly and life felt briefly, mercifully calm. He sat on an old wooden bench and motioned for me to sit beside him. He was still thinner than before, but his eyes no longer carried the lost, dim look they once held. Something clearer lived there now, as if he had finally seen the end of a long tunnel. He told me he had shaken off the group that had been tracking him, partly because of a few decent former colleagues, partly because the last and most powerful of his betrayers had finally been forced out of his seat of influence. But Ethan didn't speak much about them. He looked at me instead, and released a long breath, as though setting down a burden he had carried for years. Then he pulled another ring from his coat, not the one I received, but a new one, engraved inside with 2 letters, M and E, Maya and Ethan. He took my hand, his voice trembling in a way it never had, not even when he faced danger. "If you're willing," he whispered, "I want to begin again. No more running, no more hiding. I can't promise I'll ever be ordinary, but I promise I will protect you and Lily, no matter where we are, no matter what happens. Please, marry me." My heart clenched, not from fear but from that slow rising ache of someone who has once stood at the edge of happiness only to push it away to protect what she loved. I pulled my hand from his, my eyes blurring though my voice remained steady. "Ethan, you've sacrificed too much to keep me and my daughter alive. You risked everything so we could have peace. But if I say yes, if I step into your life fully, will we ever truly be safe? I don't want Lily to live in fear every time someone knocks on the door. I don't want you to look over your shoulder every time you cross a street. I can't raise her in the shadow of a man who is always being hunted." Ethan said nothing. He nodded very slowly, as though he had already expected this answer but still hoped for a miracle. He closed his hand around the ring, then placed it gently in my palm. "Whatever you say, it's still yours." He stood, bent down, pressed a soft kiss to my forehead, and walked away. I sat there a long time, holding the ring as if it were the last fragment of a dream I wasn't ready to wake from. I loved him, but love could not be the only thing we had, not at the cost of fear and loss. Ethan knew that. And because he understood, he left once more, this time because it was my choice. Yet deep in my heart I knew this wasn't the end. Not when 2 hearts still beat for each other, even if the whole world stands between them. 2 months after the night Ethan proposed and I turned him down, winter swept in with sharp winds cutting across the gray streets, and Lily had been coughing for 10 long days. At first I thought it was just the weather, but on the 11th morning, when she woke with bluish lips and a fever that refused to break, I knew something was terribly wrong. I carried her in my arms and rushed to the nearest emergency room, my heart pounding so hard it felt ready to burst when I saw the doctor signal for 2 more staff members. asking me rapid-fire questions before taking Lily into a special monitoring room. They said her heartbeat was irregular, that there were signs of pericardial effusion, and that it might be tied to the congenital condition she had been followed for since birth. I collapsed onto the waiting room chair, my hands gripping her small medicine pouch so tightly my fingers ached, swallowed by a numb kind of terror. I didn't know whom to call, whom to ask for help, or whether I even had the strength to seek it again. But as I stood to look for the doctor, a figure stepped into the hallway, shoes soaked with rain, coat dripping cold water, and eyes I could never mistake. "Ethan." He said nothing, simply walked to me and wrapped his arms around me. No explanation needed, no questions about why I hadn't reached out, he knew. I broke down against his chest, tears I had held back for weeks finally spilling freely, telling him through trembling breaths how afraid I was, how I didn't know what I would do if I lost Lily. He didn't answer. He only held me as if his embrace alone kept me from collapsing entirely. For 3 days while Lily was hospitalized, Ethan never left the building, not for a single second. He didn't sleep, just took turns staying by her bedside, making coffee, steadying me when I could barely stand. When the doctors recommended an interventional procedure, he was the one who sat beside me, going through each option with that rare, steady calm of his before asking, "Do you trust the doctors? Do you believe Lily can make it through?" I nodded through my tears, and somewhere inside, the trembling finally began to ease. He stood beside me as I signed the consent forms, his hand resting firmly on my shoulder to steady my trembling fingers, offering the silent strength of a true father without hesitation. Through the glass of the operating room, I watched his hand rest on my shoulder hour after hour, and I understood then that no matter what had happened between us, Ethan had never once left. In the end, the surgery succeeded. Lily was moved to recovery, pale but stable, her heartbeat even once more. When she opened her eyes and saw Ethan, she gave a faint but genuine smile and reached out for his hand. Ethan leaned in, pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, and whispered, "I'm right here, sweetheart." I stood behind them, watching quietly, feeling something inside me shift, not gratitude anymore, but something deeper, steadier. In that moment I knew that even though I had turned down his proposal months ago, the truth was that Ethan had long been an irreplaceable part of our lives. No title, no promises needed, just his presence, and everything felt bearable. And I began to wonder if perhaps it was time to open my heart again, not because I needed him to survive, but because I didn't want to keep walking this road without him. After the surgery, Lily recovered faster than any doctor had predicted. She was able to sit up, eat thin porridge, even had enough strength to scribble little heart shapes with the colored pencils Ethan bought from the hospital cafeteria. I sat beside her bed each day, watching the two of them talk as if they had been a family for years. And deep inside me, a different kind of fear began to grow, not the fear of losing, but the fear of missing something precious. Missing a man who loved my child as though she were his own flesh and blood. Missing a love I had once pushed away simply because I believed the world was too dangerous to trust happiness. I found myself missing him even while he was sitting right there, missing the quiet way he draped his coat over my shoulders when I fell asleep in the chair, missing the gentle pressure of his hand on my shoulder every time a doctor entered with a serious expression. I couldn't imagine a life where one morning I woke and Ethan was no longer there, no longer that silent, steady presence that had become part of my breath. One evening, after the nurse finished checking on Lily and I stepped into the hallway for some air, Ethan quietly followed. The night was cool, the wind threading through my sleeves, yet warmth washed through me when his hand found mine without a word. We stood side by side by a long bench overlooking the nearly empty parking lot. I turned toward him and saw the same eyes, still quiet, still shadowed with the weight of everything he carried, always thinking beyond what he ever said aloud. Softly I asked one simple question. Did he still keep the ring? Ethan looked at me for a moment, then nodded, reaching into the pocket of his coat to pull out the small box I had once held and returned to him. He opened it, and inside lay the same silver ring engraved with the initials of our names. This time he didn't propose, didn't offer promises or vows. He only looked at me with eyes that held everything his heart had longed to say. I took the ring into my hand and let out a long, unsteady breath, as if shedding a weight I had carried for too many years. I told him I was sorry for making him wait, that I had spent so many years trying to be strong alone, yet I had never felt truly steady until he stood beside me, that I didn't know what the future would bring, but if I could walk it with him, I would no longer be afraid. Ethan didn't smile broadly. He only pressed his lips together, bent down, and gently slid the ring onto my finger, holding my hand tightly afterward as if afraid that if he loosened his grip even slightly, I might slip out of his life again. We held each other for a long time beneath the dim light of the hospital hallway, and for the first time, after a long journey marked by danger, separation, and blood, I felt my life anchor into something solid. Lily slept peacefully in her room, her heartbeat steady, her breathing even, and the man I once believed would never return now stood beside me as an irreplaceable piece of everything I called family. In that moment, I didn't need a wedding, didn't need a white dress or an expensive ring, only him and me, together, no matter what lay ahead, because after everything we had survived, real love didn't need perfection. It only needed the right person at the right time. And Ethan was the one right thing my life had ever been given. 1 year after the day I accepted Ethan's proposal, our lives had changed in ways that, had someone told me earlier, I would have smiled and shaken my head in disbelief. We moved to a small town in the northern part of Vermont, where red dirt roads twist through barley fields and quiet hills draped in early morning mist. Our 3-bedroom wooden house sits at the edge of the forest, with ash-gray shingles and windows that are almost always open to the wind. There. No one knows our past, no one asks too many questions, and no one cares about anything beyond the weather, the harvest, and the small everyday matters of a modest town. Ethan used the last of his savings to open a small auto repair shop on the main road, where he spends most of his time under the belly of a car, covered in grease yet always smiling when Lily and I stop by every afternoon. He named it Callahan and Company not to assert anything, but simply because that name now means family. As for me, after years spent around old washing machines and the smell of cheap detergent, I finally opened a tiny laundromat beside his shop. I named it Lily's Laundry, both to honor the journey we survived, and because my daughter always beams when she sees her name stitched in red thread across the sign. My shop has 3 washers, 2 dryers, a small shelf offering free cookies, and an old radio that plays soft country songs all day long. Each morning, I wake early to make coffee, walk Lily to the elementary school a few blocks away, then stroll to the shop. At noon, Ethan stops by with sandwiches he makes himself, sometimes with a few fresh apples he picks from the yard behind our house. In the evenings, we pick Lily up together, then the 3 of us cook dinner in our small kitchen glowing with warm yellow light. Our life isn't wealthy, but it is full in a quiet, rounded way. No more police sirens, no more knocks in the middle of the night, no more anonymous messages, no more wary glances. Only peace shaped by the smallest things, like Lily's laughter as she plays with the little rescue puppy we adopted, or the way Ethan looks at me when I frown over the bookkeeping. Some nights I sit on the porch wrapped in a blanket, staring at a sky scattered with stars, thinking about the long road behind us. Sometimes it still feels like a dream, because it is hard to believe that a man who once lived in pursuit and shadows can now dry his hands with a cloth, wait for me as I lock up the shop, then walk me home hand in hand. But each morning, when I wake and see him beside me, breathing steady and warm in the early light, I know everything is real enough that I no longer fear what tomorrow might bring. We no longer need the past to define us, nor the future to promise anything. All we need is this present moment, our small house, the old laundromat, the grease-stained repair shop, and a love steady enough to push the rest of the world far away where it no longer matters. Spring arrived earlier than usual the following year, bringing soft gold sunlight that pooled across the wooden porch where Lily often sat reading each afternoon. After a full year of steady treatment and careful monitoring, the doctor finally confirmed that her heart condition had stabilized, no longer high risk, and that her health was gradually recovering like that of any ordinary child. The day Lily stepped out of the clinic with her good results in hand, Ethan lifted her and spun her around in the parking lot sprinkled with wildflowers, their laughter ringing through the air as if breaking apart every lingering shard of worry left inside me. To her, Ethan was not just a good man, he was safety itself, the storyteller of every bedtime, the one who replaced light bulbs, clipped her hairpins when my hands were full, and always arrived first whenever she fell or woke frightened from a nightmare. To Lily, Ethan was a father, without needing any other title. And then, just when all of it already felt full beyond measure, another small miracle found its way to us. I discovered I was pregnant one early summer morning while cleaning the laundromat, when a sudden wave of dizziness hit me. When the test showed 2 lines, I sat in the bathroom for a long while, hands trembling not from fear but from the disbelief that after everything we had endured, life was giving me the chance to begin a new chapter with Ethan beside me from the start this time. When I told him, he looked at me in silence for several seconds, then pulled me into his arms as though he were holding the entire world. He didn't say much, only kissed my forehead, knelt beside my belly, laid his hand over it, and whispered in his rough, hushed voice, "Hello, little one. It's Dad." Throughout the 9 months of pregnancy, Ethan never let me lift a single heavy thing. He opened the shop in my place, cared for Lily, even learned to cook a few extra dishes for my diet. Every night he would rest his ear against my belly, listening for each tiny movement, recording the baby's progress week by week in a small journal. Once, he measured the crib height 3 separate times, just to make sure the morning sunlight would fall gently on our baby, neither too bright nor too dim. On the day I went into labor, rain hammered the sky, but Ethan never let go of my hand, not for 1 second. He counted each contraction, wiped my forehead with a warm cloth, and whispered short encouragements that felt like strength poured straight into my bones. When the first cry broke through the delivery room, Ethan cried with him, without hesitation or shame. Our son was born healthy, with dark brown hair like mine and gray-blue eyes like Ethan's, his tiny hand curling around his father's finger from the very first moment, as if he had known him forever. We named him Elijah, a name that carries the weight of strength and hope. Once home, Ethan carefully attached a small wooden plaque with Elijah's name beside the crib, tending to every detail with the reverence of a man who had spent years waiting for this kind of peace. He was no longer the man who once lived in danger and shadow, but a father rising in the middle of the night to change diapers, mix formula, and soothe his son with a warm, gentle voice. Watching him cradle Elijah, his eyes soft with devotion as though time itself had paused, I realized I had never known such stillness in my life, not because everything was perfect, but because the man who once lost himself in a fractured world had finally found his way home, not only for himself but for all 3 of us. And I knew that whatever life held ahead, we were now a family in the truest sense. Ethan was not only the husband I loved, he was the most deserving father my children could ever have. Each morning, when the soft sunlight filters through the small kitchen window of our quiet country home, I often pause for a few still seconds just to watch Ethan making coffee, Lily tying her hair before school, and baby Elijah cooing in his crib. These moments are so ordinary one could overlook them, yet to me they are nothing short of miraculous, woven from days once filled with uncertainty, from sleepless nights beside the hum of an old washer, from cold, rainy afternoons when I thought I would collapse under unpaid bills and the exhausted breathing of my fragile daughter. I had lived in depletion and fear once alone, unseen, carrying the heavy silence of a single mother fighting for her child, until a man stepped into my life, carrying a past full of shadows and secrets that anyone else would have run from. Yet he chose to stay and change everything. Ethan is not only the man I love, he is proof that sometimes happiness comes from places we least expect. Looking back, I still remember the flickering lights of the run-down laundromat where everything began, the smear of his blood on the cold tile floor, and the way our eyes met for the first time in the middle of danger. From a crumbling place that seemed to have no way out, I walked into a new life filled with love, hope, and a complete family. My story is not a fairy tale. It is a journey of courage, trust, and the steadfast belief that no matter how dark today may seem, tomorrow can still shine if we refuse to give up. Life will never be perfect, but when you find the right person and walk hand in hand through the storms, everything gains meaning. I hope that as you hear this story, you find a part of yourself in it. Perhaps you have known loneliness, despair, fear, or doubt about whether love is real, but believe me, it is, and it is worth waiting for. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more heartfelt and inspiring videos each day. Like and share this video to help spread this story to many others. We would love to hear your thoughts. Did this story make you reflect on something in your own life? Have you ever met someone like Ethan in your world? And what did it teach you? Leave a comment below and share your truth, because the story you tell may be the strength someone else needs. Thank you sincerely for spending your time with us. Wishing you good health, joyful days, and a peaceful life always. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.